I wasn't allowed to be parked there. And he said, well, we're going to have to arrest you because you're being very uncooperative. I said, well, you're going to have to arrest me because I'm going in there, and I'm telling you right now, I don't see none of y'all in there. Y'all are standing with snipers and y'all are far away. If y'all don't go in there, I'm going in there. He immediately put me in cuffs. They uncuffed me. I jumped that first gate fence. And once I jumped it, I went to my son's class, and I knocked on the door, and I remember the teacher saying, I'm like, hey, they're already boach cutting the fence to get me. She's like, you think we have time to get out? I said, y'all have time. I'm going to run for my other son. I start yelling, and I'm being a cooperative, and I'm like, well, y'all aren't doing what are y'all doing? Y'all ain't doing y'all need to be in here. Give me your vest. Somebody give me a vest. Something. I started paying attention to how far the shots were being, so that I knew the shooter was all the way still by my first son's class. So when I went to my second son's door, the teacher didn't want to open the door for me. So that's when they started escorting me out. And as I see that they're opening my son's door, I go run for my son, and I get him.
While you were inside the school, did you see officers
There was not
inside
one
the school?
officer inside the school when I ran to my second son's class. There was not one officer.
And you were hearing gunshots, so you knew
You
that
could hear the
it was an
gunshots.
active shooter.
It was still active. The gunshots were still active. They were not in there. There was no one in there. If anything, when I pulled up, my car was closer to the school than where the snipers and everybody that was laying on the ground were.
When you heard that it took law enforcement 75 minutes before they went in and stopped the shooter, what was your thinking, having been inside the school yourself?
I don't know. I was just thinking that they could have saved many more lives. They could have gone into that classroom and maybe 2 or 3 would have been gone, but they could have saved the whole class. They could have done something. Gone through the window, sniped them through the window. I mean, something, but nothing was being done. If anything, they were being more aggressive on us parents that were willing to go in there. And like I told one of the officers, I don't need you to protect me. Get away from me. I don't need your protection. If anything, I need you to go in there with me to go protect my kids.
Welcome back, fellow dissidents. Today's topic obviously has to pertain to the gun debate. As of recently, we've had multiple nationalized corporate syndicated stories excuse me, of particularly the Buffalo shooting and in Texas in Uvalde. And since this has happened, you've been hearing the typical liberal outcries of common sense gun laws and how many tragedies do we have to hear about until we enact common sense, quote unquote, gun laws. And it's really falling on deaf ears. As of the last couple years, 26 different states have constitutional carry, which means that the other 24 states are the only states left infringing on gun rights. Now, don't get me wrong, the NFA needs to be repealed entirely. People think that these things are radical, but even in the historical context of the founders, they were abundantly aware of advancing technology. I mean, they had privateers and warships that could flatten coastal cities, and these were privately owned. They were privateers, and they would have letters of marque and reprisal, where basically they would co-opt and use these private entities in wartime and amongst the pirates and such, as we still have today. There's pirates among the seas. Nevertheless, the founders of this country, when they drafted the Constitution, they were well aware of these things. And not only that, it's not just your typical lauded acceptable opinions. it was in fact a check against the tyrannical state. And that's not to say that, the United States is going to uprise and grab arms against the federal government. While that is a possibility, however passive or unlikely that may be, it may possibly be a case, but that wasn't the intention. If you think about like what happened with Breonna Taylor, and regardless of all the circumstances of what happened, you have a militarized police force who will just kick in a door. And this time, luckily, the man was he was deemed within his constitutional legal rights to have protected himself, as he should have been. And but the reason why we don't see this more often is because no matter how militarized and corporatized the police structure becomes in this country, they know on a personal level in their mind, when they bust through that door, that there's a strong possibility that there's a legal abiding citizen in there waiting to shoot them. And that is a check against tyranny. Okay, and it's these kinds of incidents that further inculcates the militarized police state, to remind them that this is their outcome should they kick in the wrong door. Now, having said all that, like I mentioned earlier, there is the tragic incidents in Buffalo and Uvalde, and both were tragic for many reasons, let alone just obviously outright, prayers up to the people and the victims and the families of the victims. We're not even addressing the real situations behind these. Most of these mass shooters, for one, a very small proportion of them are done with AR-15. So this call for AR-15 bans and assault weapons, which is a very, it's not a homogenous idea. They don't have a definition for these words, and that's exactly the intention. They want it as broad as they can, so that way they can, issue these platitudes that mean absolutely nothing. And the underlying, the underpinning of this is literally just to take your guns. Don't get it mistaken. If the individual didn't have the absolute right or the absolute need to defend themselves, then we wouldn't have the largest standing military and empire in the United States right now. In human history. Like it's unprecedented, the level of which our empire and military, that includes the federal and the state police system as well, because they're obviously just the boot of the state. They're not they're not doing what they were supposed to do, right? But this wouldn't be needed if they didn't need if people didn't need protection, right? So and always remember that these calls are coming from politicians and bureaucrats and, these people who walk around with militarized security at all times, who indefinitely bear arms. Okay, so if it wasn't needed, then why would they need a private security force, let alone this militarized police system to oppress and tyrannize the country? Now, in the case of Buffalo, what struck me, outside of the fact that that dude was obviously a belligerent, delusional, manic person, was, as per usual, the response of the corporate press. It had both left and right parent factions pointing at the other one. He was wielding conspiracy theories that were posited by Tucker Carlson. And that was the left pointing at the right, and then the right was saying, "Oh, well, he was a racist, self-proclaimed leftist communist." So you got the corporate press holding up this manifesto and this incident and pointing at both factions. Now that strikes me as per usual. I mean, the corporate press, the bureaucrats, the state, they all want us divided, because if we stand together and can defend ourselves, well, there goes their legitimacy, because their legitimacy is the key to their reign and their tyrannical power. No matter how oppressive a dictatorship gets, they have to hold some amount of legitimacy in the eyes of the people, whether it be through force. Typically, it's through subsidies for whichever special interest, as well as the intelligentsia that spreads the ideas throughout the social order, making it seem as though this dictatorship, bureaucracy, democracy, whatever the state is, seemingly being necessary, right? But you got these young men who are obviously deranged, and I mean the one in Buffalo quite literally seemed to me, in my opinion, to be a revolutionary act. I mean, he was a self-proclaimed leftist communist. Communists, I mean, they live and die for the revolution, quite literally and figuratively. I mean, you can't mistake Marx and his writing. I mean, a majority of Marx and what you can learn from Marx is in Das Kapital, but if you read the Communist Manifesto, the revolution is pertinent. And it's got to be constant revolution, because that's the only way to get to their so-called utopia, right? But the revolution is necessary. And even Marx said under no pretext should the workers surrender arms and ammunition, using force if necessary. I'm paraphrasing. So even he realized the necessity, at least for the revolutionary period, which is cyclical, right, for the workers to be armed. But nevertheless, revolutionaries quite often want to spark the revolution, right? And that's what this act seemed to me. He was obviously a racist bigot. I mean, nobody's denying that. What his political leanings are absolutely irrelevant until you get to the point of his state of mind. And I think that's more important than any gun law. A majority of these happen in either highly restricted gun areas, like this one was particularly in Buffalo, and then you got places like Chicago where they have the strictest gun laws in the country, and yet there's just mass amounts of gun deaths. And that's because only the law-abiding citizen isn't going to have one. No matter how many, you could literally do a complete buyback and completely wipe out every legal citizen from having an arm. And the people who are intentionable on having one will have one. That's not going to stop anything, right? But the thing that gets me the most is the propaganda that surrounds it. Like I've already stated about the corporate press and their shilling for division. Excuse me. You've also got this term, gun-free zones, which literally 100% of every school shooting, including Uvalde, which we'll get to next, is a gun-free zone. And, this is a propagandized term, because if it was a gun-free zone, then none of these young men would be going into the school to shoot up folks and children, right? So it's obviously not gun-free. No, what it is an unconstitutionally disarmed zone, is what it is. Only the legal citizens who are trained and apt with carrying an arm don't have one. And that's exactly how they want it. It's by design. This entire thing where you got, members of the House of Representatives or the Senate, and they go off on these long tangents about common sense gun laws and, literally standing on the still warm corpses of these poor young children and teachers who were murdered in Uvalde. They're standing on tops of the corpses saying that the only way to stop this is to disarm the rest of the population. Because for sure, these gun laws will keep them out of the hands of criminals this time, right? It's complete propaganda. And underlying all of that agenda is quite obviously disarming people. It's like Dave Smith had recently said, that when you go to war, what are the main things that you do? You inflict harm and you disarm and propagandize the people. And it's no secret that the domestic war on terror, as heralded by our federal government, has been turned inward. It's now domestic terrorism. It's not international terrorism that they're worried about. And who makes the list? Who makes the list of who's a domestic terrorist? Well, our federal government has already announced. If you're anti-government, if you're libertarian, if you're a Trump supporter, basically anybody who stands against the establishment and their narrative, right? And this makes you a domestic terrorist. And they've turned this, they've already successfully with the September 11th attacks, have instituted these rabidly unconstitutional laws by fiat power, to where they're now allowed to just go through people's information, seize people's stuff at will, imprison them, torture them, the whole nine. Like, right? This is not news to anybody who's even had half a brain for the last 20 years. But now they've used that supposedly internationally, and as Ron Paul and Scott Horton and all the dedicated libertarians, and even just conservatives or paleo-conservatives or paleo-libertarians and anarchists and leftists as well alike, have been saying since they enacted those laws that it was going to be turned inward. And now we see why, right? And that brings me to Uvalde. Now, when it first happened, they came out and they lied about it. The police there and the press there, well, in conjunction, issuing statements from the police through the press. They lied about it, and we come to find out that a heroic mother is being harassed by the police, who are refusing to enter the building. There's an active shooter. They knew for over 75 minutes before they even entered the building that there was an active shooter, and they're terrorizing children and murdering them, as well as a couple teachers, right? And you have this heroic mother who says, I'll be damned. If you won't, I will. I will go in, right? And what do? What do? They put her in handcuffs. They tyrannize and oppress the mother who just wants to go save her children. The Orwellian doublespeak of these militarized police and politicians and bureaucrats is just astounding. And yet you still got half of the population who fall for the narrative every time it comes out. Should their thought leaders and their intelligentsia say this is our narrative, they immediately adhere to it. Now, given when it comes to Uvalde, there was a lot of people that were like, "Yo, this ain't right. This ain't right." And then after she was handcuffed, they got her out of handcuffs, and she immediately jumped the fence and booked into the school and saved her 2 children. Praise to her. Praise to her. This is why you stand against tyranny. This is why you stand against oppression. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's moral. Just because the state has a monopoly on violence doesn't mean it should. This is a perfect example. You take their whole narrative, and at base, at foundation level, they say that we need to disarm the population and let the police take care of us, right? That we already know how the left feels about it, but the right seems to agree, except for on guns. But let's put all that to the side. Let's put the politics to the side. Fundamentally, the cornerstone is that the police will, obviously by indication, be the ones that protect us and have a full monopoly on violence should we be disarmed. And then you see something like what happened in Uvalde, and the entire narrative falls apart. What do we do if we all turn in our arms, right? We say, okay, we give up. We give up on this topic. You can have your way. All legal citizens are disarmed, and then some crazy maniac goes into schools shooting up children, and the cops say, I swore an oath to the Constitution and to uphold the Constitution, which would mean not putting people in cages for years for having a gun. But set that to the side, right? And we are supposed to protect our community, right? Regardless of the situation, that is their duty. And 8 weeks prior to this incident, they had training on just this incident, right? Apparently that wasn't very well founded. But they literally didn't even enter the building for after 75 minutes. And the mother who ran in there said that there was not a doubt in her mind that she was traversing through the school by hearing the shooting. So it was an active shooting in progress, right? So all of the stuff they were standing on talking about, oh, well, it might have been a hostage situation and all that was complete BS from the get-go, right? But they completely abdicated their duty to their community, right? So what happens if this is how it is as a normal, as a foundation, as a principle, at base level? Everybody's disarmed, and we have to rely on these cowards. I'm already sickened at the fact that these politicians and bureaucrats, well, they can have all the money and power in the world and have privatized security around them at all times because that's the most efficient. You don't see them relying on the police. No, they have a complete, they either have private security or if they're at the upper echelons, they have an actual bureau, federal agents who follow them around, which is essentially, they steal your money to have the most efficient means mimicked by the private market. But nevertheless, they want this to be fundamental, just like every dictator throughout history. Just like every war propagandist and propagandist in general. They're going to tell you why you're not allowed to be armed, but they should be. And no matter the platitudes or the still warm dead corpses that they stand on to utter these platitudes, the underpinning of the fundamental conversation and dialogue is still there if you just care to take a look, right? And we've got so many people who are so desperate to have some form of conversation with these folks that they'll say, oh yeah, well, we understand that these are some of these weapons are they got high capacity magazines or they're just for sporting rifles and all this. No. Every single gun is in fact made for destruction and harm. Now you can use it for good or you can use it for bad. It's not the tool that's being used, it's the people behind it. And you've got people that, every single law, every trade, every kind of barter, it doesn't matter what it is, it's supposed to be a give and take. But our Second Amendment was in fact absolute. It was in fact absolute. If you didn't want us to have the absolute right to have the exact same power of arms that the government does, then you need to amend the Constitution. Now, I don't agree with the Constitution. I mean, I believe it was a coup d'etat to centralized power anyways. The Articles of Confederation didn't fail in the first place, right? But putting all of my biases aside, we live in reality. And in reality, we have a Constitution that hasn't been followed for well over 150 years anyways. I mean, basically since it started. When it comes to the money, when it comes to the weapons, when it comes to all kinds of stuff. And here we are. The Constitution's been poked full of holes, but they just can't seem to put a hole through that second one. They sure do got a hole through the first one. Because big tech, I can barely, I've been demoralized beyond reason. It's like if any amount of traction I do get is minimal at best, and that's completely organic. But even if I were to gain traction, who's to say they won't shut me down from speaking the truth to folks? It's it's a private company. No, it's not a fucking private company. There's not a large corporation in this world that isn't subsidized or federally contracted with or colludes with the federal government. There's not a one of them. We have a socialist / hybrid fascist dictatorship, oligarchy, whatever you want to call it. It's not the fascism of Mussolini. in the early 20th century. It's a hybrid. These people, they learn, they adapt. They are humans just like us. They're just evil ones. You see Hillary Clinton says no one actually needs an AR-15. You're right, they don't need it. It's their right to have it. Need and necessity don't have nothing to do with it. Now, I believe that, if you are apt and trained to have one, you should have one. But what I think and what Hillary Clinton thinks means nothing unless the people believe or understand what an inherent right is. The government can never take away an inherent right. It's inherent in our person. Now, they can successfully oppress that right, but they can never actually take it away, right? But nevertheless, the agenda is clear. It's not a politician in the United States backed by the Constitution should never ever fathom talking about the necessity of the need to bear arms. It's laid out. We elect representatives in a democratic fashion, which gives rise to high time preference, and people are only worried about the immediate rather than the future, which is a big part of the problem. But nevertheless, we democratically elect these representatives in our republic with constitutional laws that they have to work around. But they don't work around them. They just drive right through. And you always hear this call about these empty platitudes about our democracy. Will be very abundantly understood that when they say our democracy, they're talking about their democracy. They don't mean you, they don't mean I, they don't mean the Trump supporters, they don't mean any of them. Unless you fall in line, surrender your arms, and praise allegiance to the narrative and the oligarchs that espouse this narrative, then it's not your democracy. As a matter of fact, we don't even live in a democracy. It's increasingly becoming so. The president doesn't have the power that people make him out to have, but they want you to believe that so that way he can secure that power. And democracy is just a strong push, a regression back to or through line to a world government. We essentially have one right now. It's just compartmentalized. There's not a person in the world that thinks that, there's a couple main superpowers that control the entire globe. And it's amazing, this call for democracy, right? Should you omit or falsify or speak truth about their narrative, now you're a domestic terrorist. I mean, they were literally treasonous for the entire President Trump administration. And nobody, it's like everybody has short-term amnesia. They forget the immediate past. There's a certain amount of people who are paying attention, but it's obvious now that Hillary Clinton was trying to fucking pull a coup d'etat against Trump. And I'm not a fan of Trump or Hillary Clinton, but nevertheless, to see these people screaming about our democracy and then trying to overthrow a democratically elected president is Orwellian at best. These people are not incompetent. They are insidiously malevolent. And it's not even close. It's not even close. Not one of those politicians up there screaming about common sense gun laws are righteous. I don't believe they have the right frame of mind, or they just want to help folks. Because everything they do precipitously makes the situation worse. How is it that all of these years, these decades, fucking hundreds of years, it's progressively gotten worse, and they give you the same platitudes, the same empty platitudes, the same tyranny, the same oppression that says that, oh, it'll fix it. I mean, if you've been paying attention, it's abundantly clear that they cause a problem, and then they say, oh, well, we see the problem, and now we need to do X, Y, or Z to fix the problem. And then it exacerbates the problem ad infinitum. It's absurd that people even still adhere to any amount of what we're taught in school, what these politicians, usher down to the masses by proxy of the intelligentsia. They need their legitimacy, and it's quite obvious they're losing it dramatically with the administration we have now. I mean, you look at Trudeau in Canada, and it's like this narrative is creeping closer and closer to us. And they portray this narrative as if we're real close to this too. So many people want gun reform and gun control. And it's just not the case. It's just not the case. There's like 30 plus states that have unpermitted carry. And then there's 26 who have constitutional carry, which means you don't have to have anything. You just go in and buy it with a background check and boop, bop, bing, you're out of there. Which is how it should be everywhere. I don't even think a background check is let me, before I get too radical for some folks, in the eyes of the fact that we have a state as tyrannical as we do. Now, don't get me wrong. I think through due process, you should be allowed to be obfuscated of your right to bear arms, should you be a murderer or a rapist or whatever have you. But they use red flag laws and just delinquent behavior that they can charge you with a felony, which is quite literally what happened to me. They use these things to keep as many people at bay as possible, right? So I don't even agree with their background checks in the sense of today's state. Now, don't get me wrong. In an ideal society, it's not going to be utopia, right? But there would never be in a anarcho-capitalist or a libertarian small government society, however far we can get the Leviathan rolled back, there would never be a point where someone could say, oh, you're a legally abiding citizen and we're going to take your guns. Not for any reason, right? And there wouldn't, the narrative is not real. These things that happen are absolutely tragedies. But what would fix that? How about getting rid... First of all, we need to stop adhering to their language. These gun-free zones, sure, there's a yellow sign that wraps the perimeter of every single school in every district in this country that says gun-free zone. But that's propagandist language. It's unconstitutionally disarmed zones, right? And we need to get rid of that. These young men wouldn't be so incentivized to run and start killing people if they knew that there was going to be retribution proactively if they got in there and tried. That's not to say that it's going to diminish it completely. There's still going to be wackos. There's still going to be crazies. Most of these kids come from fatherless homes, have serious mental health conditions, have been indoctrinated by the public school system for their entire life, have poor parenting, if any at all, and are on psychoactive, psychotropic medications. Like it's the rule. There are exceptions to the rule, but it is the rule that these factors play a role in every single one of these. And the number one is that they go into areas where legally law-abiding citizens are disarmed. And we live in a democratic society where people only think from year to year. They don't think far enough ahead to where the high time preference is so damn high that people are only thinking about right now. And even right now, if every law-abiding citizen got rid of their right to bear arms, it wouldn't fix anything. It would exacerbate the problem, which is exactly what they want. I'm completely against egalitarianism. You can be or do whatever you want. You just can't coerce or redistribute for people in such matter. You can't force people to see the world as you do. The whole idea of free speech and free press and free assembly was all inherently tied to property rights. You can persuade someone to do or act with their property as you would like them to, but you cannot force it. Egalitarianism has destroyed this country. The right of association means the right of dissociation. Now, that also means that some folks will, racist bigots or sexists or xenophobes or, all of the isms and ists, right? These people will only cater to a small group, and the market will punish them for it. They will disclude this group and a large portion of society who doesn't agree with racism, homophobes, or whatever. They will disassociate with them as well. It's not going to grow. Racism and all of this crazy division has only exacerbated the problem. And the further the division grows, the stronger the state gets. The correlation is pernicious, but it is absolutely tied together. They need the division. They need at least some large amount of people to agree that the state is necessary in some form or fashion, and they have that. They have that. I mean, how many times we've got a radically progressive, quote unquote, Democrat caucus. You know, they're not actually progressive. They're not even actually radical. They only adhere to the state. We see this with Ukraine and the budget funds. They say that they hate war and they hate, they're complete environmentalists and they'll do whatever they can to save the planet. But then as soon as there's a war going on, they're the first ones to jump on the unanimous. Even the squad voted for funds for Ukraine, right? They're not progressive. They're not progressive. And the Republicans are not any better. You've got some people who claim to be pushing in a certain way, which is only for the state. And then you've got another one that says, oh, we'll just slow down the rate that this happens. But we don't have any principles to stand on. And that's where the division comes from. You've got left and right parent factions, and then you've got a small amount of dissidents who see the entire structure for what it is. And if you're here watching me now, then you're probably one of them. But always remember that they're trying to disarm you. They're calling you a domestic terrorist. They're waging war on you and your children for their brains and their bodies while they walk around with armed security, simultaneously robbing you of your money and then providing you with inefficient and militarized police. Don't ever forget that. I'll stop with that. By all means, if you enjoy this content, please like, share, subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one.